Hello, and welcome to the Evening Tea. On this episode, we return to Dotson's conversation with Norman Mailer. Taped less than a year after the tragedy of September 11th at Mailer's home in Provincetown, they begin by recalling their own memories of that day, their feelings about the World Trade Center towers, and how those feelings resulted in a minor scandal for Mailer.
When I just want to tell you what happened to me when I was on September 11th. I was talking to John last night about where he was when it happened, and I was remembering where I was, and I was supposed to go have lunch with Garth Brooks of all people.
Who?
Garth Brooks, who's a country western singer.
Yeah.
Right? And so I woke up around 9, I guess, in the morning, and late. And I picked up the phone to call him to make sure that everything was straight, and the phone didn't work. And I thought it was odd. And I thought, maybe
Where were you?
I was at home on East 85th Street.
Uh-huh.
I thought maybe I hadn't paid the bill or something, right?
Yeah.
So I got dressed and went downstairs, and I lived 4 blocks from Gracie Mansion. The phones on the street worked. And there was an oddness in people, because people were sort of wandering around kind of lost. I mean, it was a very strange sense. I started walking downtown. It was a warm, sunny, almost hot day. And I started walking downtown. And this is the point. We were supposed to have lunch at 57th and Park. And I was walking down 3rd Avenue. And when I got to about, I'd say 64th Street, I started noticing this huge cloud at the end of Manhattan in the sky, which I thought was odd. I didn't know what it was. And looking down 3rd Avenue, as far as I could see, Norman, was this, it was like a flood of people, a wave of people, most of them white shirts, men in white shirts, and they were the office workers from Wall Street. And this mass of people in absolute silence were walking up the island and turning. It was like a parade, and turning at 57th Street and moving over towards the 59th Street Bridge to cross over out of the island. And I thought, I wonder if Jesus has come again. I'm serious, because they're in white. And I thought it was the second coming, and Jesus is calling his saints home, and I'm being left here. Nobody told me. Right? All right. That was my initial feeling.
Wouldn't that be it if Jesus had come and everybody went over to Queens? That about expresses my pessimism concerning cosmic matters.
So basically, where were you? How did you find out about it? And what was your initial... I'm just trying to set the scene here.
Well, I don't recall exactly. I remember turning on the TV because somebody had already seen it on the TV. It's in the house here. I was up here.
You're up here in Provincetown.
And then I started watching it, of course. And while I was watching it, I called Brooklyn, because I have my apartment in Brooklyn, and my daughter Maggie was staying there with a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And wanted to know if she was all right. And she had seen it. She was, having seen it, she was virtually struck dumb by it. She was terribly affected by it. And as we're talking...
I mean, she just had to look across the river.
That's right. And as we're talking, the second plane hits
My
the
God.
second building, and I'm watching on TV, and her friend is watching it on TV, and freaks out. Because the friend is watching the plane hit and watching on TV, and was virtually babbling after that.
So he was seeing it in person
Seeing it in person.
from Brooklyn Heights
and seeing it on TV.
and seeing it on TV at the same time.
And it left a
Unreal.
kind of trauma, I think, in a funny way. Because the one thing the TV always promises us is, folks, deep down, secretly, this is not real.
That's right.
And it's why we love it so.
Yeah. Even reality TV is fake.
In other words, we
Yeah.
can deal with reality because it isn't real. And now suddenly it was real. It's why there's always that numbness to TV in a funny way. Those astonishing events, those striking, terrifying events, always have a touch of numbness to them, that they don't terrify us enough. We see something that's hideous, and somehow we're not shocked. in proportion to what's really going on. Now there are exceptions, very rare exceptions. The shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald, the second plane striking the second building, the collapse of the towers. Those are events where it gets real again. But as I say, that is the primal shock, that TV is not supposed to be real. It's supposed to be a code of insulation between us and the horrors of the world. And when it's broken, the impact is enormous. So, being up here, of course, you know, the bit of my blood that's still journalistic felt wistful. You know, feeling, oh, I wish I'd been in New York. I should have been in New York. And on the other hand, I didn't get the full impact of what was happening in New York. The story you just told me of people, of the huge cloud in the southern part of Manhattan, and people walking north, away from it.
It was what struck me, what I'll never forget is the silence.
Yes, yeah. All the sense impressions.
I mean, everyone, there's just silence, and it was the first time I noticed the silence being broken. And when people spoke, they spoke in a whisper. It was like everyone was at a funeral. And this went on for hours and hours. And the only thing that was broken by occasionally would be an ambulance siren or a police siren. But then, and I'd never seen this in New York before, military jets started flying over the island because they started closing the island down. And I looked up and I thought to myself, what the fuck is happening? Why are they sending fighter jets over Manhattan?
Yeah.
I'd never seen it before. And then shortly after, military started showing up in the streets.
Yeah.
Which I'd also never seen in New York.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I thought, Norman, what's this? And it has, I suppose, just to do with residual left-wing paranoia. But my thought was, my God, there's been a coup d'etat.
What?
There's been a coup d'etat.
Yeah, yeah. Well, anyway, I missed all of that.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I just didn't get a sense of the impact for days and days. And the only way the impact finally struck me was because I put my foot in my mouth. To which a good journalist, as it so happens from the London Times, spoke to me a couple of days after the event. And we had a good interview. It was an honest interview. Nothing was distorted. But there was one unfortunate element in it, which is, I was asked if I thought the ruins were more eloquent than the former building. Well, you know, people have architectural critics had a great division over the Twin Towers. Some thought it was beautiful. Many people lived in New York, loved the Twin Towers. Others despised and hated it because they felt it absolutely broke that wonderful rising slope from the Battery up to, let's say, Chambers Street in Manhattan, where it looked like the foothills of the Alps, and they rose higher and higher until you felt you were in the needles of the Alps. And all that was beautiful. Then suddenly you had these two huge teeth right at the tip, practically, of Manhattan, and it wrecked the skyline.
I thought it was presumptuous.
It was presumptuous, it was arrogant, it was, and it was disturbing because it changed the nature.
What's the word?
It changed the nature of Manhattan. And I, who looked at it all the time, saw the skyline of Manhattan get worse and worse and worse, because I used to have that fabulous view from my window. And over the years, over the next 10, 15 years, whatever it was, I saw the skyline get look more and more like a Dallas skyline. Although in all fairness to Dallas, they had a couple of interesting buildings. There were none that were put up other than the the Twin Towers. So
That's what they're doing to London now.
What?
That's what's happening to London
Exactly.
now. In
But
Paris.
at least London has the excuse that they got a lot of damage from the war. You know, there were holes in the ground. They had to fill them, and of course they filled them with the, parenthetically, I don't know if I'd agree on anything else with Prince Charles, but I certainly agree with his views on architecture. And they filled it with these abominable modern buildings that are tasteless and without creative instincts, and that show nothing but the inner architecture of a $500 million, a $10 million bill. Let me rephrase it.
Okay.
They show nothing but the inner architecture of a bill that would be 100 million pounds if they printed such a bill. They don't have to print the bill, just look at the architecture. Hideous stuff, hideous stuff.
Hideous.
All right. The Twin Towers was the finest example of hideous stuff. So you could raise an
I
argument.
agree with you.
You could raise an argument that was beautiful, and it certainly was beautiful in certain angles. But I had always had this animus toward it. And so in the course of this interview, I said to the young lady who was interviewing me, she said, "Do you think the ruins are more eloquent than?" And I said, "Yes," because there been those fabulous photographs taken already of the ruins, and it was as if, and the ruins looked Gothic.
Exactly.
They had a
Exactly.
they spoke of deeper things than the building itself.
You know what it reminded me of was pictures I'd seen as a boy of the ruins of Canterbury Cathedral after the Luftwaffe bombed it.
Yeah. All right. It had that quality, yes. And it was as if you remember, there was a rather interesting bit of, how to call it, there were some Gothic arches at the bottom of the Twin Towers that formed part of the entranceway, and that remained.
But they were like hands, they were like the fingers of hands pointing down.
Yeah. And it was as if the little bit of that building that had been exquisite was left, the essence. And so I said, yes, I think the ruins are more beautiful than the building. Well, then the New York Post got a hold of it. And said, changed one word, said the ruin is more beautiful than the building, which made it sound like all the people who were dead and buried were part of the beauty of it. It was an ugly, ugly story. And in fact, my son Michael called me up and said, "Are you out of your mind? Don't you realize how people are suffering here? And you say something like that." I said, "I wasn't talking about the people who were dead, I'm talking about the building alone." Well, that wasn't the way it came out in the paper. So I put my foot in my mouth. So after that, I then had this slightly embattled relation to the whole thing, because, given the mood of the time, we'll get into it later, but given the absolute anguish of that day, and given the unbelievable identity crisis that hit just about everyone who lived in Manhattan, and then it went out in widening circles, less and less, but all of America was affected by it, because the notion there had always been this tacit notion that we're impregnable, and in fact we have been ever since the Second World War.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Evening Tea. In our next episode, Dotson and I will discuss how Norman Mailer became famous, the last time that Dotson saw Norman, Mailer's misogyny, and his strange relationship with Truman Capote and Tennessee Williams. Looking further ahead, we will conclude our study of Norman Mailer by hearing from Norris Church Mailer, his last wife. See you then.